The Miami Dolphins made some injury designations yesterday, and we're going to explore what that means for the Dolphins and the implications for the players involved here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It's your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Tip of the cap to our everydayers because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. The Dolphins yesterday released their 4 p.m. transaction log summary on social media and announced a number of players, prominent players on the Dolphins, that had been placed on the physically unable to perform list, also known as the PUP list, the PUP. And the PUP list is something that, depending on what your designation is, could mean a number of different things. We're going to explore what it means for the designation that the Dolphins gave. But the PUP list is effectively players who count against your offseason 90-man roster, but players that for one reason or another are not going to be partaking in the day-to-day practice schedule and regiment of the players who are reporting to training camp starting next week. And for the Dolphins in particular, a number of these players are players that are coming off of season-ending injuries last year. But the cause for concern for each one of those players is kind of independently variable and dependent. And the good news is for Miami is none of the Dolphins players were placed on the reserve PUP. They were all placed on the active PUP. And those players, the Dolphins released the statement, Salvon Ahmed, running back, on the active non-football injury list, and placed Bradley Chubb, Cameron Good, Jaelan Phillips, and Isaiah Wynn on the active physically unable to perform list. So all on the active list. It would be bad news if any of these players were placed on the reserve physically unable to perform list, which is what the designation was that the New Orleans Saints yesterday gave to right tackle Ryan Ramczyk. Ramczyk is one of the better offensive tackles in the game, but all offseason long, you kind of heard the murmurs and the whispers that like his health situation was not in the best place. So for Miami, to know that all of their players went on the active list is good news. Now, what does it mean for their individual timelines as players? The rules are different for the PUP in training camp as compared to what they are during the regular season or at the beginning of the season when you cut down to 53 players. And I know that was the question that I saw quite a bit of as it pertains to these players being placed on the list. What does this mean? Is this good news? Is this bad news? Or are these players going to miss the first month of the season? Here's the summary according to NFL.com. And I'm just going to read the blurb. It's easier that way. Players placed on this list during training camp, active/PUP, PUP list. Players placed on this list during training camp count towards a team's 90-man roster, and players can be removed from the list at any time during camp, but cannot be placed back on the list during camp. So, Jaelan Phillips could show up next week and they could say, okay, yeah, you're good to go. And you could practice. Do I think that happens? Probably not. I think they're going to be deliberate there with the conditioning and the strength and working that back into place. But the other part of this that's important is to know the difference between training camp and offseason roster PUP list versus when you cut to 53. Players on this list as of final roster cutdowns must be placed on either the reserve PUP, released, which terminates your contract with the team, traded, which would terminate your term with the team, or counted against the 53-man roster. So when you cut the 53, these players either have to go to reserve PUP, be released, traded, or they have to count against the 53-man roster when you do your cuts. Now, the way that the league changes this offseason have changed is you do have a number of players that can stay on the reserve lists and get this was as of 2023, that blurb. You can have players that are designated as PUP players and IR players that can count against your players that you bring back off of injured reserve during the course of the season. You know, in the past, it's been you have to put everybody on the active roster and then put them back on a list, right? That changed this past year where it saves you from cutting a player, having him go out to the parking lot, waiting till 4:01, putting somebody back on the injured reserve list, and then bringing that player back in to sign. It closes that loophole that teams have to do with players that it's like, look, we got to cut the 53. You're not going to be on the 53 because we don't want to subject this guy to waivers. So just hang tight, and then we're going to sign you back after we formalize our transactions. So at this point in time, there's no need for concern with any of the players that went on the PUP list for Miami because, as it says, they can be activated at any point in time. Now, those individual players and whether they are activated or not, I think there's different storylines there, and that's what we're going to get into next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins, so make sure that you stick with us. Passion, drive, and patience are not just the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for, and with eBay's Guarantee Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guarantee Fit available only to U.S. customers. When you are hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals for right roles with your team, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn is not just a job board. It's a network of professionals that you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses report getting a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional with LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. For the Dolphins, I think the important thing to remember is twofold. They are very deliberately delicate and cautious, particularly early in the season, with players and rehab processes, and they understand the long-term needs of the season. So I think about Bradley Chubb, and I think about Jaelan Phillips, and I think about Cameron Good, and they were all guys that you knew were going to be question marks coming in. And it's important to bear in mind the Dolphins knew what they were signing themselves up for with those players, right? There's a reason why they drafted two edge guys and signed Calais Campbell and signed Shaq Barrett, right? Like, the infusion of new guys into the mix, not necessarily a huge surprise. That Bradley Chubb, and I think Bradley Chubb, with his timeline being an end of season week 17 player, I think he's probably the most likely on this list without knowing their individual case studies and their own recovery processes to end up on a designated injury list at the beginning of the regular season. Cameron Good, there was a patellar issue there that's up in the air. Jaelan Phillips with the Achilles. We've seen the video updates in recent weeks, or in recent days, I should say, and it's promising. But you don't want to count your chickens before they hatch, And I would imagine those guys coming into camp, being designated on these lists, they can be a part of the day-to-day and being part of the meetings. They can undergo their own individual strength and conditioning and rehab processes on the side as the team conducts their practices. And, you're kind of just touch and go, but they have a new infusion of talent into that room that you kind of know, depending on whether it's good or bad for those individual players, they've got volume. The surprise one was Isaiah Wynn, right? He goes on the active PUP. He had a quad injury against Philadelphia on the first offensive possession of the game. That was week 7. So that was the first half of the season. It was kind of teased like maybe Isaiah Wynn comes back. I think it was still like week 16, week 17. The question was being asked, is Isaiah Wynn coming back? Well, clearly not, right? Because it's not no strings attached for him coming into training camp. Now, I think there's some other players that you had some questions about, and knowing that those guys don't have any limitations, you feel good about. But for Isaiah Wynn, I would say the same thing that I say about the Edge group. The Dolphins made a decision to re-sign this player in the offseason, right? And you knew he had an injury because he rehabbed in the building for the second half of the season. So you know what you signed yourself up for, and you decided to sign yourself back up for it. Now, it's a cheap contract, but at the same time, their lack of investments elsewhere in the interior offensive line room, aside of replacing Connor Williams, would seem to indicate, even if he goes on the PUP list, is this just a matter of strength and conditioning coming back? Is this a matter of getting back into football shape because your rehab carried you through a certain point? I don't know. And we don't really know a lot of the specifics of the terms of the injury, but I think Miami's lack of assertiveness at that spot, when contrasted to their lack of, or their aggressiveness with the Edge group, paints a little bit of a picture. So knowing when his injury was, assuming, maybe it's the worst case scenario, maybe blew out his quad, right? Like knowing that they still chose to re-sign this player, haven't really brought in a large infusion of players to compete on the interior, I'm not reading too much into it. Now, maybe Mike McDaniel gets on the podium next week for his first media availability. He's asked about Isaiah Wynn, and he gives you a surprisingly candid answer that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. And if that's the case, then I would say, okay, maybe they let this process play out throughout the summer. They don't like where he's at. And if that's the case, you probably should go sign somebody else. There's a few guys on the street. You can go kick the tires on some trades if you want to. But at this point in time, I look at how they handled Edge, how they handled the guard spot, and I do feel like it's very deliberately different, and it gives me a little bit more comfort in seeing Isaiah Wynn's name go on this list, while also acknowledging I don't know anything about, this could just be like minding your P's and Q's, or you want to take your time with him to get him right. That's where I'm at with the guys that go on the list. But Isaiah Wynn was a little bit of a surprising name to see him added to the list. Now, we have some odds and ends. We have some UFL news, believe it or not, here on Locked On Dolphins. That's coming your way next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. So make sure you stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. Comparison can be the thief of joy, and it's very easy to hop on your phone and get on social media and see a bunch of people who appear to have their lives all together because you see the best versions of themselves that get put through that filter of Instagram or X or Facebook or whatever else. In reality, everybody is dealing with their own individual struggles. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient and flexible and suited to your schedule. You can fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So let's start with the UFL stuff because it's fun. The UFL this week held their um, annual draft. And if you're not familiar, the UFL is the spring league football that's kind of caught and stuck on. It was the merger of the XFL and the USFL. I think were the two that merged for it. But the Dolphins actually had a few players on their offseason roster that were drafted in the UFL draft. Now, it's obviously spring league football, so it's not as much of a concern as far as conflict of interest for Dolphins players. So maybe any old school fans that remember Sanka and Kick leaving for Memphis and bailing in the midst of what could have been a Dolphins dynasty, this isn't that kind of thing, and these aren't that caliber of players. So a collective exhale for everybody here on the show. But Gabriel Murphy got drafted in the second round of the UFL draft, and Andrew Meyer, the center from UTEP, got drafted in one of the later rounds of this 10-round draft. So what this means is those players do retain those rights for spring league. If these players for Miami are not affiliated with a team, come this time next spring, they can play for those teams that drafted their rights in the spring league and potentially have a chance to kickstart themselves. But it was pretty interesting to know that Gabriel Murphy was one of the top 15 players that got drafted in the UFL draft. So that is an area, as we just got done talking about the PUP and the injury list stuff. Maybe there's an opportunity to catch on with the Cameron Good role on the roster. If Cameron Good's not ready to go and you need a special teams type player, that's a place Gabriel Murphy can get some inroads. Do I expect it? Not necessarily, but that's the magic of training camp, right? Is you put the pads on and guys go out and they kind of make stuff happen. So that was a little bit of off the beaten path, fun stuff that came through over the course of the week. And then the other thing to watch is, of course, we're going into the final weekend before reporting for training camp, and we're on contract watch. It seems like the buzz on the Tyreek Hill thing has died down a little bit. Maybe this is just a matter of we're waiting for Miami to resolve whatever they're going to do with their starting quarterback and his contract long term. The thing to watch, there's been some rumblings with an off the beaten path insider who has had a lot of good intel throughout he hasn't bat 1,000, but it's an anonymous social media account that has been very plugged in. His username is Pretty Ricky, and Pretty Ricky back at the beginning of June posted that the Packers had interest in getting Jordan Love's contract done before Tua Tagovailoa's and Dak Prescott's. And Pretty Ricky gave an update yesterday that seemed to hint and allude that the Packers are very close to finalizing their deal with Jordan Love. Do I think Jordan Love checks in above Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence? No. I'd be surprised if that was the case with a one-year sample size as a starter for Jordan Love. And I know Mike Tannenbaum would give him $60 a year for 10 years and call it a day. But I'd be surprised if it was that aggressive. But it's kind of the last domino to watch if it's going to fall. And for Miami's purposes, if it were to check in above Burrow and Lawrence, it only further complicates the negotiations that you've presumably been working on since you had to go back to square one when Trevor Lawrence kind of blew up the whole thing with a $55 million a year contract on average for the AAV. Now, the true value of that is a totally different story. Again, it's worth remembering Trevor Lawrence won't sniff over $50 million in a single season of cash flow, not cap or not average, but cash flow until like 2028. And obviously it's nowhere close to 2028. So the terms of that contract are much more favorable than the reported terms, but nevertheless, the annual average of it was tied for first. And that complicates with Miami what their efforts were. And you kind of read between the lines, the fact that it wasn't done and these contracts got done felt like every time one got done, you had to go back to square one and sort it out. So just knowing that Green Bay is kind of on the cusp and the precipice of that, or they may be on the cusp and precipice of that, is certainly a storyline to watch as we go into the weekend where Miami has their own potential interest in getting this thing knocked out themselves. Can they beat the Packers? Would the Love contract not influence the negotiations between Tua and athletes first and the Dolphins in the first place? If it doesn't, then you can kind of shrug your shoulders and say, oh, like, okay, like, let's finalize what we're working on and get it done and get it inked and hopefully not have this distraction hanging over your head going into training camp. Because I think that would be the healthiest place for the team to be, is to not have this as a storyline in focus. So everybody's kind of on the clock now. And you've kind of seen that throughout the course of the week with rookie contracts getting done, with rookies showing up to camp. So that saying, once again, deadline spur action. Now we're kind of hearing a little bit of buzz that the Packers may be next in line. We'll see what the Dolphins have in store, if they have anything in store. That's going to do it for us, though, here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate you guys checking the show. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I'm Kyle Krabs, your host, and I am out of here. Go Dolphins. I'll talk to you all again soon.